The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Godson, co-CEO with Momentum Events. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here for this afternoon's webinar presentation. Before I introduce today's presenter, a little housekeeping for the attendees on this call. Firstly, there will be a Q&A at the conclusion of this session. If you have a question for the presenter, Scott Maberry, please use the question panel, which you'll find to the right of your screen in the GoToWebinar main GoToWebinar panel. In addition to which, this session is being recorded, and also Scott has generously agreed to make the PowerPoint presentation available at the conclusion of this event. So everybody listening to this right now will receive an email from me within 24 hours, which will contain a link to the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to the audio recording of this presentation. With that being said, it's my great pleasure to introduce Scott Maberry of Sheppard Mullin. Scott is here to talk about a new latitude, charting a course for Cuba. So with that being said, Scott, over to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to first give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about, and then present the slides to you. There aren't very many of them, so we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I also know that in the promotional materials for this seminar, Matt promised you a dynamic panel of experts, and that panel is me. So if anyone's disappointed that there's only one person, I'll try to do a funny voice every other slide or so and make it so there are more people here on my side of it. So the first I'd like to talk about, kind of in order of what the President said in his speech on December 17th. And by the way, there's a slide toward the end linking you to some coverage of that speech and to the speech itself. He talked first about opening diplomatic relations with Cuba. I'm going to give you some details on that. He also talked about addressing the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Cuba is currently so designated, and we'll talk about what he's planning to do with that. Then I'll get to what I think is the meat of what many of the people on this line are interested in, and what the majority of the questions that I have gotten have addressed over the last, let's say, 2 weeks since the announcement. That is the current and proposed status regarding travel and transactions in Cuba and with Cuba. And then I think there will be some important steps between here and there. One thing that I'll say 2 or 3 times throughout this webinar, in which you should bear in mind, is that no changes are effective until new regs are promulgated, and in some cases until new statutes are passed by Congress. So you can't go running out and doing the things that are as yet just proposed, for example, subject to a proposed general license, until that general license comes out in regulations. I'll give you some detail on that. Lastly, I'd like to go through 3 or 4 different areas of specific opportunity, and then, as I said, there's a final slide giving you some links to the various resources on the topic. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the portions of the last slide talking about 2 upcoming full-day seminars on the topic, one in March and one in April. The details will be forthcoming. Lastly, I would like to leave plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A message box. Matt will collate those and relay them to me as we wrap up, so there'll be plenty of time to get to your questions, I hope. There's a beautiful U.S. flag there and a beautiful Cuban flag there. You might notice that something's going to have to be done about this immediately if we're going to normalize relations. That is, the Cuban flag is about 3 inches longer than the American flag, and I don't think we can really have that. So we'll put in a note to the President about that. Here's what we're going to do with diplomatic relations. President Obama has proposed that he will open a U.S. embassy in Havana this year. Here's a little history, and the picture down there shows the U.S. Embassy Havana right in the center left of the screen there. You architecture aficionados in the crowd will recognize that as an early and prominent example of the brutalist architecture style. I kid you not. It was erected in about 1953 and has remained somewhat strangely in U.S. hands more or less since it was erected. So in 1961, we broke diplomatic relations, and from 61 to 77, we had no diplomats in Cuba. We had an interest section in the Swiss embassy, and the Swiss kindly took care of that building for us during that time. The Swiss embassy is down the road. What you're looking at there is the Malecon, and down to the left about 4 kilometers is the Swiss embassy. To get you some orientation. Now, after 2015, oh, and by the way, our interest section from 77 to 2015 has been stationed in that building. There's a current U.S. chief of section who is our top diplomat in Cuba right now, and his office is in that building. And presumably that'll be the building for the U.S. Embassy Cuba. The next thing, President, and by the way, that's well within the President's prerogative to do. He doesn't need congressional approval or oversight to do that. There are several steps toward that. He's opening conversations right now with Cuba. And by the way, very interestingly, you'll see on the website that's linked at the end of this presentation about the announcement itself some photographs of the President. Right before he made his announcement, he spent some time on the telephone with President Raul Castro of Cuba talking about some of these issues. So there actually has already been high-level dialogue, and it's the first time a U.S. president has spoken to a Cuban president since the revolution. So quite interesting. The state sponsor of terrorism designation. Cuba is one of 4 countries designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. The designation came in 1982, and the rationale for it, it's very interesting. The statute under which these designations take place have a few criteria. And the things that were determined to meet those criteria in 1982 were first, that Cuba was a safe haven for members of the ETA and FARC. Now, you have to really remember the 70s and 80s to remember who ETA and FARC are. FARC is the Colombian rebels, and ETA was the Basque rebel movement, neither of which is extremely active right now, and neither of which, by the way, has received a ton of support from Cuba in recent times. The other rationale given was harboring U.S. fugitives, and that's an interesting one, too, because here are said fugitives. That is Joanne Chesimard. Joanne is a fugitive in Cuba. She is wanted in the United States for the 1973 killing of a New Jersey police officer. They have not extradited her. They consider her a political refugee from the United States. I think we kind of need to bring her back to the United States in order to normalize relations, if for nothing else to let her know that she has outlasted the fashion cycle on the Afro hairdo. That extremely sane-looking person right there is Joshua Hacken. He's kind of a different story. He kidnapped his kids, and he and his, I guess his second wife, fled with those kidnapped kids to Cuba. Cuba extradited him back to the United States in 2013, I believe it was. So harboring U.S. fugitives, though it was something that happened somewhat more frequently in the 80s and 90s, is happening less now. And in fact, Hacken is only one of 3 or 4 examples of people who have returned to the United States to face justice, having fled initially to Cuba. One of them was the homesick hijacker. I can't remember his name. Some of you may remember the story. He hijacked a plane, landed in Cuba, got political asylum there, lived there for many years, decided he was tired of living in Cuba and wanted to come home, and came home and faced U.S. justice because he was homesick. So the effect of a designation as a state sponsor of terrorism is that there's an arms embargo. That probably will never go away. We will probably not in a very long time get to a point where we're selling munitions items to Cuba. Even if the state sponsor designation is lifted, Cuba will remain a so-called 126.1 country. That is a country subject to that section of the 22 Code of Federal Regulations, the U.S. International Traffic in Arms Regulation, that puts restrictions on bans export of munitions items to several countries, including Cuba. It also imposes very strict export controls on non-munitions items. So those are not going to go away quickly, although as you'll see in a minute, some will be in a position to be modified as part of the President's announcement. Another thing that it creates is a ban on U.S. economic aid. So the United States has been prohibited by statute from providing economic aid to Cuba since the 1982 designation. Here's what's going to happen. The President has directed U.S. Secretary of State Kerry to review and revise, or to review and recommend a course of action on the designation. By statute, Secretary of State has to review several things. One, has Cuba supported acts of terror within the last 6 months? We're fairly certain that based on, at least on publicly available information, the Secretary will find the answer to that to be no. Second, to determine if Cuba has renounced the use of terrorism. Third, to review whether Cuba has ratified relevant anti-terrorism treaties. And by the way, there is an important hemispheric anti-terrorism treaty of which both Cuba and the United States are members. Then, according to the statute, Secretary of State Kerry has to report to Congress for Congress's review, and Congress, the information that he finds that's relevant to any of those areas has to be with Congress for 45 days before President can do anything with the recommendation that Kerry would give him. That doesn't give Congress the option under this statute to block any change of the designation, but gives them a review. And then President has asked for Secretary Kerry's recommendation on the state-sponsored designation within 6 months from December 15th. So we expect that that'll happen. A senior State Department official came onto a telephone conference call regarding the announcement very recently, in which that official said that it's possible that Secretary Kerry will act more quickly than 6 months, and so that remains to be seen. But those are the steps on state sponsor of terrorism. So next I want to talk a little bit about doing business with Cuba. And the way to start, I think, this will be review for many of you if you're familiar with sanctions laws. What are the rules now? And you could have a whole day seminar on this, and we have. As co-chairman of the American Bar Association's National Institute on Economic Sanctions, we've hosted a number of kind of full-day-long or two-day-long seminars on sanctions, and there's a lot of detail to these. So this is a very high-level review, but we have a comprehensive economic embargo on Cuba as of now, and what that really means is that all transactions with Cuba or in Cuba or in any interest or property interest of Cuba is prohibited unless it's authorized in the regs. Importantly, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the jurisdiction over U.S. persons and companies on the Cuba sanctions also extends to foreign companies that are owned or controlled by U.S. persons. So, so unlike with some of the other sanctions programs, a U.S. company cannot have a foreign subsidiary that does business with Cuba under the current rules. There's a little tweak to that that's being proposed in the new regulations, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The regulators for our Cuba embargo primarily are the U.S. Department of Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control, and you'll hear me and others, and probably yourselves from time to time, referring to that as OFAC. There's a link to OFAC's website in the slides. And also the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. That is our commercial export control authority in the United States. Both will have to take some action to implement the President's proposals, as I'll discuss in more detail in a minute. Now, under the Cuba embargo, under current law, there are so-called general licenses for certain things. And a general license, as many of you know, is the kind of license that operates by force of law and does not require a specific application. It just requires you to meet the criteria that are set forth in the regulations, which, by the way, appear in Title 31 of CFR within Section 515. The general licenses authorize certain humanitarian gifts. They authorize the delivery of mail. They authorize the provision of telecommunications services, and they authorize you to take certain steps to protect your intellectual property in Cuba, although slightly differently from some of our other sanctions regulations. And by the way, that's a theme of U.S. sanctioneering. Because they're all developed at different times for different national security and foreign policy reasons, they all have different terms, and even things that look similar from one to another are interpreted differently. Separately, under the Cuba embargo as it currently stands, you can go to OFAC and apply for a license for certain things. By the way, for some of these, BIS is also involved, and there we go talking about both agencies that regulate the Cuba embargo, the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. For example, if you have certain medical devices, and by the way, there's a list of them that are approved, and there are a bunch of very, very standard items. Nothing very sophisticated is approved under these regulations. But certain medical devices can be exported to Cuba under a favorable licensing policy, same with food and same with agricultural commodities. But another way to think of the embargo against Cuba is that really everything is prohibited unless it's permitted in the regs, and that probably won't change. The overall approach of the embargo can't be changed except by much more complete and full reform that won't come as a result directly of the president's opening in this case. This is going to be a much smaller and more piecemeal type of reform, but as you'll see, substantial in its own right. Here are some proposed changes, and this doesn't purport to cover all of them, but the ones that I thought would be of most interest to this audience based on the inquiries that I've gotten since the announcement by the president from my clients and contacts. The first is he's proposing a new treatment of certain types of exports. So, for example, certain U.S. banks will be able to open correspondent accounts with Cuban banks. That'll allow a much more smooth and streamlined processing of remittances and the flow of funds back and forth between the two countries. This one is significant if you are a credit card company. U.S. credit cards will be usable for authorized travel. Thirdly, certain communication services and equipment are currently under a license requirement and may soon come under some kind of a general license or at least an improved treatment, and communications infrastructure. The change, the kinds of changes that we're specifically talking about with respect to these goods, we have yet to see. I've got some thoughts about what direction that might take, which I'll get to in a slide a little ways down. Here are the next set of proposed changes that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and we'll pause a little bit on some of these because they're a little nuanced. The first one is that under a proposed general license that the president referred to in his announcement, it would change the law as to U.S. subsidiaries of U.S. companies. Remember how I told you that under the current law, if you're a foreign subsidiary of a U.S. company, you are required to apply this law and to comply with this law just as if you're in the United States. Well, there are certain transactions with Cuban individuals not living in Cuba that might soon, under a general license, come out from under this embargo and be permitted. We have yet to see what the content of that will be. That's not a very big change, and it doesn't change the way a non-U.S. company would do business in Cuba if they have a U.S. parent, but it might change how they might do their, for example, denied party screening. Honestly, my own view is that that's going to cause more difficulty administratively for U.S. companies and their foreign subsidiaries than what they have right now, which is administratively simple. That is, you have to act as if you're a U.S. company if you're a foreign company that's owned by a U.S. company. Secondly, if there is a, by the way, just to go back to the nature of the embargo as it stands now, the assets of Cuba and all nationals of Cuba were blocked in U.S. banks as a result of the initial imposition of the Cuban Assets Control Regulations. That's part of our embargo. The President proposes to unblock the accounts of Cuban nationals who have relocated to a third country. That would be new policy, and that's not the majority of the blocked accounts, but that's a substantial amount of money that could be unblocked by U.S. banks, and you're going to see a lot of U.S. banks scrambling to comply with some of these rules once they are issued. Thirdly, there's a proposal that U.S. persons would be allowed to participate in third country professional meetings and conferences related to Cuba. By the way, that was prohibited under certain circumstances, under the current regulations. Interestingly, for the type of things that we're talking about here, that is legal analysis of the embargo, that's never been prohibited, and that's why we've had conferences on what's going on with the Cuba embargo, and that'll continue. But remember, as with all of these things, none of these measures is effective until regulations are amended. I'm going to turn now to travel, and travel has always been an interesting feature of the Cuba embargo. A lot of people, myself included, believe that the travel ban in the Cuba embargo has constitutional infirmity because it violates certain First Amendment principles. However, it's been a prominent feature of the embargo really since the beginning of the comprehensive embargo. And what it says is it's prohibited to travel to Cuba, directly or indirectly, unless specifically authorized. Now, some types of travel are currently under the existing law authorized under general licenses. And as I mentioned before, a general license is one that operates as the force of law without having to apply for a license for your specific activity. But if you look at the regulations on each of these general licenses, there are a lot of really tricky provisions that you have to comply with, and if you don't, you're in violation. And believe me, we've seen lots of cases, and I've handled several cases, enforcement actions by OFAC, where a person or a group of people have gone to Cuba under the impression that they're within the general license and clearly weren't because of some problem in complying with the little nuances of each of these general licenses. So for example, certain family visits are authorized, but not all family visits. If you're not a, quote, close relative, you don't get the general license. By the way, if you're visiting a close relative that's not a Cuban in Cuba, that doesn't comply. So there's all kinds of little nuances for each one of these. I'm not going to go through all of these areas, but the thing to note about this, and I'll show you in contrast to the next slide, is that there are a long list of types of travel, some of which are currently under general license, and some of which you've got to go apply for a license for. For example, if you're Beyonce and Jay-Z, you're supposed to go to OFAC to get a specific license to go do a public performance. They didn't do that, so they got in some trouble with OFAC. And as a side note, when I wrote a blog article on Beyonce and Jay-Z's trouble with OFAC, I also tried to do what modern people do and get the word out on that issue on Twitter. And my Twitter account was promptly closed. So I think the message there is the internet does not like it when you make fun of Jay-Z and Beyonce. So nobody on this line is allowed to tell Jay-Z or Beyonce that I'm still making fun of them for going to Cuba without a license. Similarly, you have to get a license now to do certain humanitarian projects or activities with your foundation or institute, or if you're publishing something. The thing to remember because this is going to be a feature of the Cuba embargo even after the president's reforms go into effect, is that tourism travel is, and will be prohibited. There's a statute that prohibits that, and until we get some action in Congress, that's not going to change. So when you see the next slide, you will not see tourism travel on the proposed authorized travel. So here are the proposed changes. Still, travel will be prohibited unless authorized, but the President is proposing to expand the general licenses to all of these areas. So as you can see, comparing and contrasting slide 11 to 10, there will be some areas where previously you had to get a specific license, where now you can, under the proposed provisions, you would be able to travel by virtue of a general license. And then in addition to those, there will be specific licenses available for case-by-case consideration on travel that's not specifically authorized under the general licenses. I think OFAC will probably be looking at this as a way to see and process fewer license applications, which is a good thing, which ties into my point that I'll make a little bit later on how I think there are some very thoughtful and thorough people at OFAC currently writing regulations and working very hard to implement the President's proposals, and I expect to see some results, maybe sooner than you might expect generally U.S. regulatory change. Remember that tourism travel will continue to be prohibited until and unless Congress changes the law that prohibits it. So the question a lot of people want to know, now fewer people than used to want to know back in the 90s, but the question you hear a lot is, can I bring back cigars when I go to Cuba? And the answer is yes, and that's been different over time. As you can see from the clever graphic here, the cigar indicating 1990 regulation or thereabouts allowed you to bring back up to $100 worth of tobacco products from Cuba if you were there on licensed or authorized travel. So let's say you were there, you have one of these AgMed licenses to sell your products in Cuba under the humanitarian laws. You go there, you close a deal, you go shopping, you bring back some cohibas. If they're less than $100 worth, you won't get stopped at the border, and you're fine. In 2004, that law was changed, and the middle cigar represents $0 worth of Cuban cigars you could bring back. And that's the current law. You cannot import tobacco products from Cuba. And by the way, you can't do that directly or indirectly. It's a prohibition. It's a violation of this prohibition if you walk into, if you're a U.S. citizen or national, and walk into a cigar store in Madrid and buy Cuban cigars. That is a violation of the sanctions as well. This rule says, or the proposed rule will say, that if you're on licensed travel to Cuba, you will be able to bring back certain dollar amount worth of goods, of which $100 can be cigars. So the third cigar there represents $100 worth of cigars you may be able to bring back with you if you travel lawfully to Cuba in the future. Don't try it now. You will get stopped at the border. And by the way, the Customs Service in about 2004, coinciding with this $0 policy, issued a Cuban cigar update in which the Customs Service declared that, one, any Cuban tobacco brought into the United States will be considered contraband. Two, any unbanded cigars brought into the United States will be considered contraband. That's because they presume that if your cigars are banded, they are legit, and if they're unbanded, you've gotten them from a cigar store that sells Cuban cigars, either in Cuba or someplace else. And thirdly, and this is the part I really love, that any contraband tobacco products found being brought back by travelers into the United States will be, quote, destroyed by burning. So if you ever go to JFK Airport and look out the back of Terminal 2, you'll see where the U.S. Customs Service has its offices, and you'll very often see some customs officers out there in the back puffing away on Cohiba cigars. Apparently that's the way to destroy a cigar, by burning. So how are we going to get from here to there? How are we going to end up with a lifting of U.S. economic sanctions on Cuba in the way that the President of the United States has asked to be done? Well, certain things, as I've alluded to throughout, are well within the purview of the President's power, either as Commander-in-Chief or as the leader of the executive branch, including establishing diplomatic relations, issuing executive orders, amending Treasury regulations, and amending commerce regulations. So anything that requires those four types of activities, I expect the President to do and to succeed in doing. On the other hand, a lot of our Cuban embargo is codified in statute. And as you'll see, a lot of those statutes were passed during the time when there were a lot of very, very active sanctioneers in Congress, 1992 to 96. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, also known as Libertad, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992. Sections 5 and 16 of the Trading with the Enemy Act go back a little farther, but all of those have, for example, the asset blocking, the ban on tourism travel, the ban on most imports and exports. Those things, by and large, will have to wait for congressional action to be changed. And I'll try to sort some of that out for you over the next few slides, who's going to do what and how we're going to get there, and maybe even a little bit about when. So OFAC, that is the Department of Treasury agency that administers the embargo and including the blocking regulations, OFAC has said that it will amend the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, and Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew has said, quote, in the coming weeks, he expects that to be done. And that was a quote on 17 December. So now, coming weeks could mean 2, 3, 4 weeks, and it could mean 52 weeks, or it could mean 100 weeks. So that doesn't really mean anything. But what I take that to mean is that sometime in January or February, we will start to see some new OFAC regulations, and the easiest ones for them to implement are some of these general licenses that I've mentioned before. So I would keep an eye on OFAC to see what regulations come out. By the way, if you Google OFAC, you'll find a page that looks like this page here. That is the OFAC Resource Center, and there's a place to subscribe to recent actions. And you'll get an email or an RSS feed that tells you what the President has, or what the Secretary of Treasury has done, and you can narrow it by various agencies, including OFAC. So you can actually get up-to-the-minute updates from OFAC on what they're doing with regulations. There's a link to that page on the slides too. But if you don't get it, or if you want to get it before Matt sends you the slides, just Google OFAC and go to their website. Separately, Commerce will have to amend the Export Administration Regulations. That has also been the subject of some discussion in a background conference call involving senior administration officials. Again, December 17th, a senior commerce official declined to say when those regs would be amended, and those may be a little harder to get through and may not come quite as quickly as the OFAC regulations, but we're monitoring those to see what happens with the commerce regulations. And remember, as with all of these, no changes take effect until the new regulations are issued. Now, as I mentioned before, Congress has a role in all of this, and if you can imagine a Republican-controlled Congress coming into session, I believe today, having had the entire break to digest the President's statement and all of the back and forthing on the President's statement on Fox News, you may expect Congress to be a little bit ambivalent. And here's my representation of Congress being ambivalent. That's the caning of Charles Sumner in 1855. That's how Congress behaves when they're ambivalent about an issue. I love the other members of Congress back there spilling ink and yelling at each other, and some are frowning in woe, and some are laughing with glee. And look at the blood on the end of the oak cane there. That's what I expect to happen in Congress. I don't expect a lot of laws to be passed one way or the other in Congress with respect to the Cuban embargo. So when you think about what's going to happen in Congress, just remember J.L. McGee's lithograph of the caning of Charles Sumner, and you'll know what I think is going to happen. Now, going back to OFAC, though, here's Jack Lew saying not just when, but also what to expect. What are we focusing on? Well, if you parse the words of his statement, he says we want to increase travel, commerce, communications, and private business development. So if you're looking for opportunities in Cuba and you're looking out for OFAC regs to change and you want to be well positioned for what's going to change, think about increases in non-tourism travel, in commerce, in communications, and in private business development in Cuba. And I'll mention another thing about business development in a second that I know some of you will find very interesting. Secondly, and this is I think also substantial when you think about what things the administration is going to emphasize, his view, and I know this reflects the President's view too, is that he wants to promote positive change for Cuba's citizens. And I think it would be useful for all of us to be thinking along those lines, both for doing good while we're doing well in Cuba, and also in terms of what things might be more favorably viewed if they are subject to a licensing requirement, and you've got to put in a license application to Treasury. If you can show how it's going to promote positive change for Cuba's citizens, you might be in a better position than if you can't show that. Here is where I'm going to talk about some of the sectors that have started to pop out in my review and in my contacts and clients, where we think that the opportunities may start under these new proposed reforms. The President has said that the following areas will be authorized for export. And remember, the Cuban embargo currently says no exports to Cuba except where authorized, and so this is a big change if these items are authorized for export. And remember, none of these is effective until regulations have been promulgated. One, certain building materials for private residential construction. So if you are in the building materials for private residential construction business, you'd want to look out very carefully for OFAC and BIS regulatory change coming in the next few weeks and months on those goods, and figure out what you can sell to Cuba. Goods for use by private sector Cuban entrepreneurs is the second area that was specifically called out as goods that will be authorized for export. And lastly, agricultural equipment for small farmers. So those are areas I would look to as initial opportunities in commercial goods. Next, I want to turn to financial services. This represents a very substantial proportion of my current client base and of the questions that I've been getting on the Cuba opening. First of all, as I mentioned before, U.S. banks will be permitted to open correspondent accounts at Cuban banks, and that will allow them to process payments a lot easier. And as you'll see, there will be a lot more authorized payments with respect to Cuba, so that's going to be very important. Hasn't happened yet. We got to wait for regs to see what exactly that's going to mean. Secondly, this has been interesting. If you're selling your medical devices or your agricultural products or your commodities in Cuba under one of those licenses that I mentioned before, you had to have cash in advance in order to ship. And cash in advance used to mean exactly what it says. It used to mean that you had to have cash in advance before you could ship, and that was very hard to do, and that limited the number of people who could actually sell ag med commodities under those licenses. The definition, according to the President's announcement on this, will be changed so that it means you get cash before transfer of title, and hopefully, according to the President, that might provide more efficient financing of authorized trade. If you've ever tried to get financing for trade, there's some difference, although not a monumental difference, between those two definitions of cash and advance. I think it's true, though, that it will provide much more efficient financing, and I think a lot of people who haven't had opportunities will have under that little change. And the third is one I've already alluded to, Visa and MasterCard and American Express and diners, and I guess not diners anymore. The U.S. credit card companies will be able to process a credit card transaction for travelers in Cuba. Remember, that's only with respect to authorized travel. Now, I also foresee some real opportunities in the travel and hospitality business. The first and easiest one is going to be that if you're a traveler in the 12 categories that are now proposed to be subject to general licenses, you are going to be able to go to any service provider so long as that service provider has good OFAC compliance, and you can book your travel services to Cuba. That is substantial because, as it is now, in order to book authorized travel to Cuba, you have to use one of the OFAC authorized travel service providers. And if you go on OFAC's websites, you can search your way around and find the list of authorized travel service providers. That's a good thing, but a really good thing is under the new proposal that'll be opened up to other travel service providers. So if you're a travel service provider, you should think carefully about what it means to be compliant with OFAC regulations. And so a lot of my clients in that space are now looking carefully at their OFAC compliance procedures and making sure that they comply with current regs and are poised to identify and comply with any regulations that come out with these changes so that they can process travel arrangements for Cuba under the new licenses. And along the same lines, the general licenses that will come out, according to the announcements, will authorize the provision of travel services by these service providers. So, so if you're a travel service provider, you won't need a specific license to provide the travel service, which you used to have. Okay. Another very significant sector where I've identified opportunities is Internet and telecommunications. The President really wants to increase the Internet saturation of Cuba. His announcement referred to a figure of 5% of Cubans have Internet access. It's one of the lowest in the world for per capita Internet access. The President wants that to increase. That will be facilitated somewhat by allowing an Internet provider to establish the necessary mechanisms for commercial telecom and Internet, and that will include infrastructure. And when you think about all the things that are involved in telecom and Internet infrastructure, all of those things in terms of the provision of service. And remember that one of the features of the embargo is that not only is the export of goods prohibited, but the export of services is prohibited. We expect that some of these services will now become either subject to a general license or subject to a favorable licensing treatment. We'll just have to look for what OFAC does with these regulations. But in any event, if I'm in Internet or telecom services or infrastructure, I'm going to be looking very carefully at the regulations as they come out. Now, this is kind of the last substantive point I want to make, after which I'll show you a couple slides on upcoming events, and then that leaves us a good 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. That is, I think there's a very important policy opportunity here too, and we can all be a part of it. Honestly, I think the President's announcement came slightly awkwardly. I don't know if any of you had the same reaction, but I know that the opposition did. In particular, there have been kind of two main themes of criticism of the President's announcement from the right mostly. One has been that the negotiating strategy of giving diplomatic relations and increased import-export should have come at some price, and the President, quote, gave something for nothing on Cuba. Setting aside whether that's strictly true, I think the rhetorical position that takes probably will stick. I mean, that's a criticism that the President is going to hear for the rest of his term when it comes to the Cuba opening. Secondly, the exchange of political prisoners coming at the same time as the opening of commercial relations also struck some people as awkward at best, and I think there's some reason for that. What I'm getting to here, though, is that setting all of that aside, there are some very substantial benefits that Cuba could realize as a result of increased U.S. business, and one of them is an area that is represented in this slide, and that's the rule of law. I think there are going to be some important mutual incentives with a lot of potential new U.S. investment because U.S. investors, more than any other investors in the world, kind of demand stable rule of law. They want to know that their contracts are going to be honored. They want to know that their businesses aren't going to be expropriated. They want to know that there's going to be transparency of government and judicial decision-making, all the things that make a country a good home for investment, none of which exist in Cuba as it is right now, or at least as far as a U.S. investor is concerned. So Cuba is going to have to take some steps, I think, if it wants to attract U.S. investment, which rationally it would want to make assurances about the rule of law. And the more that happens, the better it will be. And the reason that's good, not just for business and for the country, is that the better rule of law applicability there is, the more transparency there is for people in the country, and it tends to correspond in every country where there's increase in rule of law with increase in democratic participation and increase in civic engagement and increase in private enterprise. So all of that, I think, is good and could be good for the Cuban people. And I've got a hyperlink here to an initiative of LexisNexis and the Atlantic Council. By the way, another partner in that initiative is UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the business principles for rule of law, and I urge all of you to take a look at that and to get an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of this important policy opportunity with respect to the opening to Cuba. Here's a slide of resources. I've got a link to the President's speech. I've got a link to the U.S.-Cuba Business Forum. A lot of the questions that I'm talking about and issues that I'm talking about are being discussed very actively on that LinkedIn forum. My blog is globaltradelawblog.com. There will be a day-long summit in New York called the Corporate Council Summit on Cuba. And that I'll give you the dates on that in a second. And then later will be the Cuba Opportunity Summit. And here is a slide with the details on that. My law firm, Sheppard Mullin, is going to be a sponsor of these events, and we're very much looking forward to a full day on legal, regulatory, and compliance focus for March 2015, and then business strategy and operations focus for April 2015. I think these are going to be very valuable webinars, and as I believe Matt will be able to tell you, attendees of this webinar will get a promo code to get a discount on on attending those events. With that, I'd be pleased to open up to any questions that anyone might have. So please let me know if there are any questions.
Scott, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. We do actually have quite a number of questions. So I'm conscious of the fact we have about 10 minutes or so before the conclusion of this webinar, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can.
Great.
If there's anything, I'm going to give you an easy out. So if there's any here that are too detailed or you're not kind of able to answer them kind of immediately on the fly, because some of them I suspect are a little bit nuanced, I'm going to allow you to kind of graciously decline or to come back at a later date.
Good, and then you'll get to say we've stumped the chump. So everybody try to stump the chump. Let's do the question.
Okay, very good. First of all, I just want to remind everybody that yes, we're going to give you the copy of the presentation and the recording, and you'll all receive a link to that within 24 hours. You'll receive an email with those links. So that is a couple of times we got that question, so that take that one away. All right. So, question. If credit cards will be authorized to support travel in Cuba, then would the authorization include travel insurance provided to or purchased by the cardholder?
Oh, great question. I think that I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that OFAC is well aware of travel insurance because it's had several cases on travel insurance. I can't guarantee that it's going to be foremost in their mind in writing any general license on credit cards, but it's an excellent thought, and by the way, one which we might consider bringing before OFAC as part of some dialogue as the regs are being written. That's one that might cut widely across sectors, and one that might be worth putting together a presentation to the OFAC reg writers on. I'd be pleased to talk with the questioner on that one about maybe putting something together. Good idea.
All right, I'll pass those details on. Can a U.S. company utilize a foreign subsidiary to open up a hospitality-based business?
Great question. The answer is probably no. The reason for that is that the regulations as they are written right now, and by the way, I think this aspect will remain after these reforms, is that it's unlawful to do anything indirectly that you are prohibited from doing directly. So if it turns out that it's prohibited to start a certain kind of business, then you may be prohibited from doing that through your subsidiary. The distinction with some of our sanctions programs, not Cuba, is that if a foreign subsidiary were on its own to engage in that business without the assistance or direction of the U.S. parent, that would not be a problem. The interesting thing about that question, though, is there's a premise in the question that the hospitality business itself may be prohibited, and I think that remains to be seen. I will be very interested to see how these regs come out, because although tourism travel from the United States or by U.S. persons will be prohibited, it may not turn out that that owning a hotel, for example, in Cuba or a rental agency in Cuba would be prohibited. We're just going to have to see. I think there's some really fruitful ground there. I'll say lastly on this question that I would not expect any resolution of that question to come in the first wave. That is the wave that I kind of am hopefully expecting to come in OFAC regs within the next January, February timeframe. But thereafter, I'd expect that we'd start to see some clarity on what types of actual investment, what types of actual business there will be permitted and prohibited, and that one remains to be seen.
Okay, great. Can you please give an example or two of the protection of IP exception? Does this mean a U.S. company can currently apply for and own Cuban patents, trademarks, and copyrights? If a U.S. company can't sell U.S.-made products to Cuba that could be covered by the IP, what rights are there to enforce in Cuba? And the flip side of this, Cuban companies owning U.S. IP rights?
Yeah, great question. The Cuban companies owning U.S. IP rights has been the subject of a lot of litigation, including by the Bacardi company. You can Google that and see some really interesting court opinions on that question. Going back to the protection of U.S. rights in Cuba, the reason for such a protection is essentially to preserve the ability of U.S. companies to maintain a mark, let's say, and not let that mark fall into the control of somebody else. The rules on this are extremely arcane, and they differ widely as between the Iran sanctions and the Sudan sanctions and the North Korea and the Cuba sanctions. So it's a little beyond the scope of what I'm prepared to describe today. But the reasoning behind it is really more of preserving marks for a future time in which there'd be an ability to use them in the country, and to preserve them against kind of being appropriated by commercial interests inside Cuba.
Okay. Do you think that in the future it will be possible to do business in Cuba in the oil and gas sectors? If so, how long do you estimate that could take?
I think that's really a fascinating question. I do think it's possible. I wouldn't say it's going to happen in the next year. If I had to put a time frame on it, I'd say that was going to be in the 5-year time frame. But boy, am I no expert on that particular sector in Cuba. I've only had 1 or 2 matters over my entire career where we've dealt with that, and I do know that there will be some demand, and I do know that there are European companies doing such business. I think that if the United States is going to get into business with Cuba, it ought to get into business in that sector too. Haven't seen anything on it yet, and I wouldn't foresee it in the first tranche.
Okay. Similarly, what's the outlook from both the Cuban and U.S. perspective for U.S. individuals and companies that own real estate in Cuba?
Oh, great question. As to the Cuban perspective, that's one of those doing business in Cuba kind of regulatory nitty-gritty issues that we're going to, I'm sure, get into probably in the second of the 2 New York seminars that I mentioned. The first will be more of a policy regulatory focus, and the second will be more of a nitty-gritty, I think, business focus. That said, I think that we ought to start thinking about these issues right away, and I don't know the rules on property ownership, or for that matter on labor and employment, or the other things that will be really important in Cuba if we're going to be doing business there. As to and we'll have to sort those out, and there will be some opportunities to kind of show a demand for transparency to the Cuban government in that regard, if they're going to be investors. On the U.S. side, I don't expect the current proposals to result in the opening up of the sanction to that extent. Investing in land in Cuba is currently prohibited, and I don't see anything in the president's proposals that propose that for now. So I would say that would be something, again, for the 1 to 5 year time frame, not for the within 1 year time frame.
Okay, thank you. We have lots more questions. We have more and more coming in. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to them all. Do you have any information on whether subsidiaries of U.S. financial institutions will be permitted to open accounts for Cuban nationals residing outside of Cuba or the U.S.?
I don't have any information on that, except as to what the one announcement says, which, if I remember it right, and it's on one of the slides, but I can't, from personal knowledge, go beyond what that said, which was that there was going to be some kind of authorization, I presume a general license, for non-U.S. subsidiaries to conduct certain business with Cubans residing outside of Cuba. So that may be an indication that that will be permitted generally, and if that were true, it would overcome the general prohibition on opening accounts for Cubans. But it remains to be seen how that provision is written. If I'm a financial institution, I'm going to be looking very carefully at that general license. I might also do what I suggested to the other questioner, which is think about engaging with the OFAC reg writers on some specific issues that ought to be clarified sooner rather than later, and that one's one that also kind of similarly to the other one might cut across several different institutions and maybe would be worth putting together a unified voice on.
Wonderful. Okay, well, that brings us to 3 o'clock. We do unfortunately have more questions, but we're not going to be able to have time to get to them all today. So my apologies if you posed a question. I will pass them all on to Scott so that he can have those in hand, and I'm going to make sure that he has the details of the question as well. With that said, I want to thank you so much for doing such an excellent job. I know that the situation is still murky and things are kind of evolving rapidly with Cuba. As Scott mentioned, Momentum, my organization, is preparing to launch 2 events at which many of the questions will be discussed in a greater detail. The first one is going to be taking place March 24th in New York City, and that's the US-Cuba General Council Summit. So that is designed, it's a regulatory compliance-focused event oriented for general counsel who have been charged with the task of overcoming whatever both US and Cuban regulations are going to be in their way as they start to execute their Cuba strategy. And then there's a second event which is in partnership with the Wharton Business School, and that's going to be less legally focused, more focused on business strategy and opportunities in Cuba. As a reminder, you'll all receive an email within the next 24 hours with the details of the with PowerPoint as well as the recording of the session. With that, I want to thank everybody for your attentiveness to today's webinar. Scott, I'll hand it over to you to say your goodbyes.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
All right, and thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again. Bye-bye.